Welcome to the Drowsy Jester. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. They say the way to understanding a culture is through its food. In medieval times, what people ate, how they prepared it, and when they gathered at the table revealed everything about their world. Tonight, we explore the daily meals of ordinary people, the peasants and farmers who made up most of medieval society. From dawn porridge to evening pottage, from preservation to preparation, we'll discover how they fed themselves through the changing seasons. If these gentle tales from history help you unwind, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other wandering souls discover this corner of the realm. Now, let yourself get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When we imagine medieval food, we often picture grand feasts in castle halls, roasted boar, spiced wine, elaborate dishes served on silver platters. And yes, those feasts happened. But for most people in the Middle Ages, food was simpler, humbler, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the seasons and the work of their hands. Let's start our journey at dawn, in a peasant cottage, where the day begins with the most important meal. Medieval peasants typically woke with the sun. There were no alarm clocks, no electricity, no artificial light to extend the day. When darkness fell, you slept. When light returned, you rose, and with rising came hunger. Breakfast, when eaten at all, was simple. Bread and ale were the foundation. Not the bread we know today, soft, white, uniform, but dense, dark bread made from whatever grain was available. Barley, rye, sometimes oats. Wheat was expensive, reserved mostly for the wealthy. Peasant bread was hearty, filling, meant to sustain hours of physical labor. The bread might be day-old, even several days old. Nothing was wasted. Stale bread could be dipped in ale or milk to soften it, making it easier to eat. Children and elderly people with fewer teeth often ate this way. Ale, we should note, wasn't quite like modern beer. It was weaker, safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated. Everyone drank ale, men, women, children. It was part of daily life, as common as water is to us now. Small beer, they called it. Just strong enough to be safe, weak enough to drink all day without becoming intoxicated. Some mornings, if a family had a cow or access to milk, they might add that to their bread. Cheese, if they had it. A bit of butter. These were luxuries for many peasant families, not daily staples. Pottage was another breakfast option. Imagine a thick porridge or stew made from oats or barley, sometimes with vegetables added if any were available. It simmered in a pot over the fire, warm and filling. You could eat it with a wooden spoon, or simply dip your bread into it. Eggs, when available, were treasured. A family might have a few chickens pecking around the yard, providing eggs through much of the year. These could be boiled, fried in a bit of fat, or added to pottage. But eggs were also valuable for trade, so they weren't eaten thoughtlessly. Breakfast wasn't elaborate. It wasn't meant to be. It was fuel. Energy for the long day ahead, in the fields, the workshop, the household. Quick, simple, filling. Now, here's something interesting. Not everyone ate breakfast. The very idea of breaking your fast early in the morning was sometimes frowned upon by the church. Eating before morning prayers was considered gluttonous by some. So many peasants simply worked through the early morning hours on an empty stomach, waiting for the midday meal. Picture a peasant woman in the early morning light. She's already been awake for an hour, tending the fire, checking on children, perhaps milking a cow or gathering eggs. She tears off a piece of yesterday's bread, dips it in a cup of ale, and eats standing up by the fire. Her husband has already left for the fields. The children are stirring. The day is beginning. This was breakfast. Simple, quick, practical. Let's drift now to midday, when the sun is high and work pauses. The midday meal was more substantial than breakfast. This was when peasants took a real break from their labor. Fields were hot at midday. Better to rest, eat, let the worst heat pass. Dinner, as it was called, happened around noon or early afternoon, and the centerpiece of dinner, almost always, was pottage. Pottage deserves our attention because it was absolutely central to peasant life. Imagine a large iron pot hanging over the fire. Into this pot went whatever was available, grains, vegetables, sometimes a bit of meat or fish, herbs from the garden, salt if you had it, water or ale to cover it all, and then it simmered. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, with new ingredients added as the pot was emptied and refilled. The beauty of pottage was its flexibility. In spring, you might add fresh greens, leeks, onions, cabbage. In summer, peas and beans. In autumn, root vegetables like turnips and carrots. In winter, whatever remained from storage. Dried peas, perhaps. Salted meat if the family had slaughtered a pig. The pot itself was precious. Many families owned just one cooking pot, and it hung over the fire constantly. This was both cookware and preservation method. Keeping the pottage warm meant it was less likely to spoil. Bread accompanied every meal. Always bread. Peasants might eat a pound of bread each day, sometimes more. It was filling, relatively inexpensive if you could grow your own grain, and portable. A man working in the fields could carry bread in his pouch, eating it throughout the day. Cheese appeared at dinner when available. Hard cheese kept well, and a small piece with bread made a satisfying meal. Soft cheese spoiled quickly, so it was eaten fresh or not at all. Vegetables were more common than we might think. Medieval peasants didn't live on bread alone. They grew gardens, small plots near their cottages where they cultivated onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, peas, beans, turnips. These gardens were vital for survival. Meat was rare in peasant diets, but not entirely absent. A family might slaughter a pig once a year, usually in autumn before winter set in. The meat would be salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved. Small portions could then be added to pottage throughout the winter, stretching that single pig across months. Chickens were kept for eggs rather than meat, but an old hen that stopped laying might end up in the pot. Fish, if you lived near water, was more accessible. Salted herring was common, affordable, and could be stored. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval peasants didn't lack for flavor. They used herbs liberally. Parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary grew in kitchen gardens. Mustard was popular. Garlic and onions featured in almost every pottage. They couldn't afford expensive imported spices like pepper or cinnamon, but they made the most of what grew locally. Salt was crucial and sometimes difficult to obtain. It preserved meat, flavored food, and was necessary for health. Coastal communities had easier access. Inland communities might travel to salt markets or trade for it. The midday meal was eaten together when possible. The family gathered around the table, though often table meant a board laid across trestles, wooden bowls, wooden spoons, maybe a shared cup for ale. They ate their pottage, tore their bread, and talked about the work remaining in the day. And then, after eating, back to work. Fields didn't plough themselves. Animals needed tending. There was always more to do. Let your mind rest here for a moment. Picture the rhythm of it. The sameness, yes, but also the comfort of routine. The same pot, the same bread, the same simple meal shared with the same familiar faces. Evening came as the light faded. Supper was the final meal of the day. Supper was typically lighter than dinner. Often, it was simply more pottage from the pot that had been simmering all day. More bread, perhaps some ale. But supper also had a particular quality to it. The work was done. The day was ending. Families gathered in their cottages as darkness fell outside. The fire provided warmth and light. This was when stories were told, when the day's events were discussed, when children asked questions and parents gave what answers they could. Supper might include leftovers from dinner, that piece of cheese not finished earlier, the heel of the bread loaf. Nothing went to waste. Every crumb had value. On special occasions, saints' days, harvest celebrations, weddings, supper might be more elaborate. An extra bit of meat in the pottage, fresh bread instead of day-old, a special ale brewed for the occasion. But these were exceptions. Most evenings, supper was simple, familiar, quiet. Children often ate the same food as adults, just smaller portions. Babies were nursed. As they grew, they'd be given soft bread soaked in milk or ale, then pottage, mashed if they were very young. By the time a child could walk, they ate what everyone else ate. Imagine the scene. A peasant family, mother, father, 3 or 4 children sitting around their small table as the last light fades from the windows, a single candle or the glow of the fire providing light. They eat their pottage in wooden bowls, using bread to soak up the last of it. The youngest child is already drowsy, leaning against their mother. The day's work has left everyone tired but satisfied. This was supper, the gentle close to the day's cycle of eating and working. Now, let's explore how these meals were made possible through preservation and storage. Medieval peasants couldn't go to a grocery store. They couldn't refrigerate food. Everything they ate, they either grew, raised, foraged, or bartered for. And most of it needed to be preserved to last through winter, when nothing grew. Grain was stored in sacks or bins, kept as dry as possible. Mice and rats were constant problems. Cats weren't just pets, they were working animals, valued for keeping rodents away from precious food stores. Vegetables that couldn't be eaten fresh were stored in root cellars. Turnips, carrots, onions, these could last months in cool, dark conditions. Cabbage could be buried in the ground under straw. Apples and pears were stored carefully, wrapped individually sometimes, laid out so they didn't touch. One rotting apple could spoil a whole barrel. Drying was common for many foods. Beans and peas were dried after harvest. Herbs were hung in bundles. Mushrooms could be dried. Even fish could be dried or smoked. Salting preserved meat and fish. After slaughtering a pig, the meat would be rubbed with salt, packed in barrels, covered with more salt. This drew out moisture and prevented spoilage. The meat would be incredibly salty by modern standards, but it kept in water. Before eating, you'd soak it in water to remove excess salt. Smoking was another preservation method. A smoking shed or chimney allowed meat or fish to be hung in smoke for days or weeks. The smoke dried the food and gave it flavor while preventing decay. Pickling existed, though less common among peasants due to the cost of vinegar. Wealthier households pickled vegetables more frequently. Cheese and butter were ways of preserving milk. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially in summer. But turned into cheese, it could last months. Hard cheeses lasted longest. Butter, salted and packed into crocks, could be stored for weeks. Every family had their stores, their carefully hoarded supplies meant to last through winter. Running out before spring was a real fear. Hunger was always possible. And this brings us to seasonal variations, because what you ate changed dramatically through the year. Spring was the hungry time. Winter stores were running low or gone entirely. The previous year's grain was nearly used up. New crops hadn't yet matured. This was when peasants ate the sparest meals of the year. But spring also brought wild foods. Dandelion greens could be foraged, wild garlic, sorrel. These fresh greens, after a winter of dried and preserved foods, were desperately welcome. Spring was when hens began laying again after winter. Those eggs were precious. Summer brought abundance. Gardens flourished, fresh vegetables every day, berries in the woods, milk from cows who had fresh grass to eat. Summer pottage was thick, with fresh ingredients. Harvest season in late summer and autumn was the most important time of year. This was when the grain was cut, threshed, and stored. When vegetables were pulled from gardens, when fruits were picked, every hand was needed. Work went on from dawn to dark, and there were harvest feasts. After weeks of back-breaking labor, communities would celebrate together. Bread from the new grain, meat from animals slaughtered because they couldn't all be fed through winter, ale brewed specially, dancing, singing, relief. Autumn was when pigs were slaughtered. November, typically, after the pig had been fattened on acorns and forest forage all year. The entire community often helped with butchering. Nothing was wasted, every part of the pig was used. Meat, organs, blood for sausages, fat for lard, skin for leather. Winter was survival. You ate what you'd stored. Pottage made from dried peas, bread from stored grain, salted meat doled out carefully, root vegetables from the cellar, dried apples. Winter was also when ale supplies might run low. Small beer could go sour in warm weather, so it was often brewed in autumn for winter drinking. The cycle repeated. Spring hunger, summer abundance, autumn harvest, winter preservation, year after year, generation after generation. Let's talk about the tools and techniques of medieval cooking. The hearth was the center of every peasant home, an open fire, burning constantly or nearly so. Rekindling a fire from embers was easier than starting one from scratch, so the fire was maintained. The cooking pot, as we've mentioned, hung over this fire on a hook or chain. The height could be adjusted to control cooking temperature higher for gentle simmering, lower for vigorous boiling. Some households had a griddle, a flat iron surface for cooking flatbreads or oatcakes. These were cooked directly over the flames. Ovens were rare in peasant homes. Building and maintaining an oven required significant resources. Instead, many villages had a communal oven, often owned by the lord. Families would bring their bread dough to this oven to be baked, paying a fee or a portion of the bread. Kneading dough, shaping loaves, waiting for the oven to be ready. Collecting your baked bread, this was a social occasion. Women would gather, talk, share news. The village oven was a hub of community life. Wooden implements were standard. Wooden bowls, wooden spoons, wooden cups. Some families might own a few pewter items, but wood was cheap and functional. Knives were essential. A peasant would have a knife for eating, for cutting, for preparing food. This same knife might be used for many tasks throughout the day. Trenchers were common. These were thick slices of stale bread used as plates. You'd put your pottage or meat on the trencher, and when you finished eating, you ate the trencher too. Or, if you were feeling generous, you might give the gravy-soaked trencher to the family dog or to the poor. Water for cooking came from wells, streams, or rivers. Carrying water was constant work, usually done by women and children. Heavy work. The wooden buckets were filled, carried back to the cottage, poured into vessels for use. Grinding grain was another task, often done at home with a handmill, 2 stones, one turned against the other, crushing grain into flour. This was hard physical labor. Many villages also had a mill powered by water or wind, where peasants could bring grain to be ground, again paying a fee. The work of preparing food was immense. Everything required physical effort. Nothing came easily. And yet, there were rhythms to it. Patterns. A woman who had spent her whole life preparing meals in the same cottage with the same pot over the same fire knew exactly how hot to make the flames, how long to cook the pottage, when the bread was ready. Here's something worth considering. The monotony of the diet. Day after day, the same bread, the same pottage. Variations, yes, based on what was in season, but fundamentally, the same meals repeating endlessly. We might find that unbearable. We're used to variety, to choosing from dozens or hundreds of options. But for medieval peasants, this repetition was normal. It was comfort. The familiar was safe. And there were small pleasures within that sameness. Fresh bread from the communal oven, still warm. The first peas of summer. A bit of honey on feast day. A cup of good ale. They noticed these small variations more than we might, precisely because the baseline was so consistent. Feast days brought special foods. Christmas, Easter, Saints' days, these were marked with better meals. White bread instead of dark, meat, pastries made with butter and eggs, ale brewed strong. The church calendar provided structure to the year, and food was part of that structure. Fasting periods like Lent meant no meat, no dairy. Fish became the main protein, pottage made without animal products, bread and ale. Breaking the fast at Easter was a celebration. Eggs, forbidden during Lent, were especially symbolic. Colored eggs, shared eggs, eggs in abundance. Religious fast days were numerous. Wednesdays and Fridays often, plus Lent, plus various other holy days. For peasants, this actually aligned somewhat with economic reality. Meat was expensive and rare anyway. But the contrast between fasting and feasting made both more meaningful. The absence of meat during Lent made its return at Easter more joyous. Let's think about portions and hunger. How much did a medieval peasant eat? We know bread was central, perhaps a pound or more per day per adult. Pottage, maybe a bowlful or two. Ale, several cups throughout the day. But here's the truth. Many peasants were chronically underfed, especially in late winter and early spring. Not starving, perhaps, but hungry. not getting quite enough to feel full, rationing stores to make them last. Children, growing and active, were often hungry. Old people, less able to work and thus less valuable to feed, sometimes went without so younger family members could eat more. Famine was a real danger. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A harsh winter could kill. Disease in the livestock could devastate a family's food supply. And yet, people endured. They shared what they had. Communities supported each other when possible. The church provided some charity. Neighbors helped neighbors. There was a social contract around food. If you had plenty, you were expected to share. Hospitality was important. Travelers might be given a meal and a place by the fire. This wasn't just kindness, it was survival strategy. Today you help someone, tomorrow you might need help yourself. Gleaners, usually the poor, the widowed, the elderly, were allowed to follow harvesters through fields, picking up grain that had been dropped. This was accepted practice, a way to ensure the most vulnerable had at least something to eat. Let's drift now to some specific foods and ingredients. Bread. We keep coming back to bread. Dark, dense, hearty. Made from rye or barley mostly. Sometimes mixed grains, maslin, they called it, a mix of wheat and rye. The process of making bread was labor-intensive. Grain needed to be ground into flour. Dough needed to be mixed flour, water, salt, sometimes a leavening agent like yeast from ale. Kneaded until smooth. Left to rise if leavened, shaped into loaves, baked. The smell of baking bread was a daily part of life, comforting, primal. The same smell that comforts us now. Thousands of years of human association with fresh bread and safety and sustenance. Pottage. We've mentioned it often because it was that important. The word itself covers a range of thick soups and stews. Frumenti was pottage made from wheat. Peas pottage from peas. Oatmeal pottage. Some pottages were thick enough to eat with your hands, using bread as an edible spoon. Others were thinner, more like soup. Legumes, peas, and beans were crucial. They provided protein in a diet that lacked much meat. Dried peas and beans stored well. They could be added to pottage, cooked into a mush, or ground into flour. Fava beans were especially common. Chickpeas in some regions, lentils, all these provided sustenance through long winters. Vegetables varied by region, but some were universal. Onions and garlic, cabbage and kale, leeks, turnips and parsnips. Carrots, though medieval carrots were often white or purple, not the orange we know today. Greens of all sorts, chard, spinach, lettuce in summer. These were often boiled rather than eaten raw. Grains beyond wheat, barley for bread and for brewing ale, oats for pottage, rye for bread, millet in some areas. Dairy products were valued when available. Milk, though it spoiled quickly. Butter, often heavily salted to preserve it. Cheese in various forms, soft cheese eaten fresh, hard cheese that could last months. Buttermilk, the liquid left after churning butter, was drunk, fresh, or used in cooking. Whey, the liquid left after making cheese, fed to pigs, or occasionally drunk by people. Eggs were versatile, boiled, fried, scrambled, baked into dishes, used to enrich bread. Meat, as we've discussed, was special. Pork from the family pig, chicken from an old hen, perhaps mutton if you kept sheep. Beef was rare. Cows were more valuable for milk and labor than for meat. Game meat, venison, rabbit, wild birds was legally the property of the lord. Poaching was punished harshly. But yes, some peasants did risk it when hunger pressed too hard. Fish was more accessible. Herring was cheap and abundant. Eels from rivers and ponds. In coastal areas, all sorts of sea fish, smoked, salted, dried, or eaten fresh. During Lent and other fast periods, fish replaced meat. This made fishmongers important figures in the community. Fruits varied by season and region. Apples and pears kept reasonably well. Cherries, plums, berries in summer, eaten fresh or preserved in honey, or made into preserves if you could afford the honey or sugar. Nuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, chestnuts were foraged in autumn. These provided fat and protein, and they stored well. Honey was the main sweetener. Sugar existed but was rare and expensive, imported from far away. Honey came from local bees, often kept in simple hives near the cottage. Honey sweetened special breads, preserved fruits, was used in medicine, herbs and flavoring. Parsley grew in nearly every garden. Sage, thyme, rosemary, fennel, dill, mint. These were used fresh in summer, dried for winter. Mustard plants grew easily. The seeds were ground to make mustard, which added flavor to bland dishes. Garlic and onions weren't just food, they were also considered medicinal, good for health, protective against disease. Vinegar, made from sour ale or wine, was used for flavoring and preservation. Ale deserves more attention. This wasn't a luxury, it was daily sustenance. Weak ale, as we've said, safer than water. Drunk by everyone, all day long. Brewing was women's work, usually. Alewives brewed ale at home, often selling the surplus. A bundle of sticks or a branch hung outside a cottage signaled that fresh ale was available. The process was simple but required care. Grain, water, heat, yeast came from the air or from a previous batch. The resulting ale was cloudy, nutritious, slightly alcoholic. It didn't keep long days or weeks at most, so it was brewed frequently in small batches. Let your thoughts settle here. Imagine the work of it all. The constant labor of feeding a family when nothing came easily. And yet, there was skill in it. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter, father to son. A good cook was valued, someone who could make a delicious pottage from humble ingredients, who could brew good ale, who could stretch scarce resources through creative cooking. Now, let's consider meals through different perspectives. Think about a young child in a medieval peasant family. Food is central to their day. They wake hungry. Breakfast, if there is any, is whatever their mother gives them: bread, softened in milk, perhaps. A drink of ale. Then the day's work begins. Even young children had tasks: tending younger siblings, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, helping in the garden. By midday, they're genuinely hungry. Dinner is the highlight: a bowl of pottage, warm and filling. Bread to dip in it. They eat quickly, hungrily. Afternoon work, more hunger building. Supper finally arrives as darkness falls. More pottage, more bread, hopefully enough to satisfy the gnawing in their belly. Then bed. Sleep comes easily to a tired, fed child. For an adult, the perspective is different. Food is worry as much as sustenance. Is there enough? Will the stores last through winter? Should we slaughter a chicken now or wait? A peasant mother planning meals isn't thinking about variety or enjoyment. She's thinking about survival, making sure everyone gets fed, stretching resources, hiding the best food for when it's most needed. A peasant father knows that his ability to do heavy labor depends on having enough to eat. Hunger makes you weak. Weakness means you can't work as hard. Can't work as hard means less food produced. It's a cycle that can spiral downward quickly. For the elderly, food might be scarce. If the family is struggling, old grandparents might insist they're not hungry, saving food for the children, or they might be given the smaller portions, the lesser cuts. In times of famine, the old died first, not through cruelty, but through the brutal mathematics of survival. The young had futures, the old had already lived theirs. Seasonal workers hired hands at harvest. Traveling craftsmen were fed as part of their wages. A harvest worker might receive meals plus a small amount of coin. The quality and quantity of food provided was part of the agreement. Let's think about the social aspects of eating. Meals were communal when possible. Family ate together. At larger gatherings, harvest feasts, weddings, holy days, the community ate together. Sharing food created bonds. Offering someone bread and ale was offering hospitality, friendship, trust. Table manners existed, even among peasants. Children were taught not to grab, not to speak with mouths full, to wait their turn. Simpler than noble etiquette, certainly, but still present. Conversation flowed during meals. Plans for the next day's work, gossip from the village, stories told and retold, jokes, complaints, laughter. The meal was a break from labor, a moment to connect as humans rather than as workers. And there was ritual to it. grace said before eating, thanking God for the food. On Sundays and holy days, the meal after church was special, set apart. The Lord's feast was different. Peasants who worked the Lord's land might be invited to certain feasts, harvest celebrations, for instance. There they would see foods they never ate at home: white bread, roasted meat, pies and pastries, wine instead of ale. These occasions were both wonderful and alienating. Wonderful to taste such foods, alienating to be reminded of how differently the Lord ate every day. But mostly, peasants ate among themselves, in their own cottages, with their own families. The familiar rhythms, the same wooden bowls, the same pot over the same fire. Now, let's take a moment to explore the actual process of making some of these foods in more detail. Understanding how something was made helps us appreciate what it meant to eat it. Bread making was an art and a science. A peasant woman might start before dawn, mixing flour and water in a wooden trough. The flour was coarse, nothing like the refined flour we know. It had bits of grain husk in it, sometimes small stones from the grinding process. She'd add a pinch of salt if she had it. Salt was precious. Then came the question of leavening. Natural yeast from the air, from a bit of old dough saved from yesterday's batch, or from the foam of fermenting ale. Mix it in. Knead the dough, pushing and folding, pushing and folding. This took strength and rhythm, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, until the dough became smooth and elastic. Then the dough had to rise. She'd cover it with a cloth, set it in a warm spot near the fire. Wait. In warm weather, an hour might be enough. In winter, longer. When the dough had doubled in size, she'd punch it down, shape it into loaves, round loaves, typically. Then another wait while the shaped loaves rose again. Finally, time to bake. If she had her own oven rare, she'd use that. More likely, she'd take her risen loaves to the communal village oven. There might be a wait, other families ahead of her. But eventually, her loaves would go into the hot stone chamber. The smell of baking bread would fill the air. 30 minutes, 40, 50, depending on the size of the loaves and the heat of the oven. When they came out, crusty and golden brown on the outside, they'd be set aside to cool. That was bread. Hours of work for a few loaves that would be gone in days. Different breads had different qualities. Maslin mixed grain bread was common because it used whatever grain was available. Pure rye bread was dense and dark, with a distinctive sour flavor. Barley bread was even heavier. Oatcakes, cooked on a griddle, were flatbreads, unleavened, quick to make. White bread, made from sifted wheat flour, was for the wealthy. Peasants might taste it once a year at a harvest feast, if the Lord was generous. It was lighter, softer, easier to chew, a luxury they couldn't afford in their daily lives. But their dark bread sustained them. It was filling, it lasted, and after a day in the fields, that dark bread dipped in ale or pottage tasted like exactly what they needed. Let's think now about water and why ale was so important. Clean water was not guaranteed. Rivers and streams were used for washing, for waste disposal, for watering animals. Wells could be contaminated. Drinking water directly was risky. Stomach illnesses, worse diseases. Ale, because it was boiled during the brewing process, was safer. The alcohol, even in small amounts, killed some bacteria. So ale became the default drink for everyone. Small beer, they called it. Weak beer, around 2 to 3% alcohol by volume, roughly. Strong enough to be safe, weak enough to drink all day without getting drunk. Children drank it. Pregnant women, the elderly, everyone. Cups and cups of it throughout the day. Water was used for cooking, for washing, for animals. But for drinking, ale was better. The process of brewing created community. Alewives, women who brewed ale, were essential members of any village. A good alewife was valued. Her ale might be traded for other goods, or sold for small coins. Brewing happened regularly, several times a month in most households. The grain would be malted, soaked in water until it sprouted, then dried. This converted the starches to sugars. The malted grain was crushed, mixed with hot water, and allowed to steep. The liquid was drained off, boiled, cooled, and left to ferment. Within days, you had ale. Cloudy, nutritious, slightly sour, slightly sweet, perfect for daily drinking. Ale that sat too long went sour. Truly sour ale wasn't wasted, it became vinegar for cooking and preservation. Strong ale, brewed for celebrations, had more grain, more alcohol. It was a treat, something to savor, to share with neighbors on special occasions. Wine existed, but it was expensive. Imported from wine-growing regions or produced locally in areas with suitable climates. Peasants rarely drank wine. That was for the church, for nobles, for special religious celebrations. But ale was theirs, daily, familiar, sustaining. Let's drift now to the kitchen garden, that small plot of earth that meant the difference between hunger and sufficiency. Every peasant cottage had a garden, small, perhaps, irregular in shape, but tended with care because it mattered. In this garden grew the vegetables that filled out meals, onions and leeks in neat rows, garlic scattered throughout, cabbages forming their tight heads, peas climbing up simple trellises made from sticks. The garden was the woman's domain, typically. She knew every plant, watched for pests, pulled weeds, watered when needed. Spring in the garden was a time of hope. As soon as the ground could be worked, seeds went in. Peas first, they tolerated cold. Then onions, leeks. As the weather warmed, beans, cabbages, root vegetables. Every seed was precious. Many were saved from the previous year's harvest. The best pods of peas were left to dry on the vine. These seeds would be planted next spring. The best onions were left to flower and set seed. This practice, saving seeds, meant that each family's vegetables were adapted to their specific plot of land. Generations of selection had produced plants that thrived in those particular conditions. The garden needed constant attention. Water carried from the well in dry spells, weeds pulled before they choked the vegetables, pests, cabbage, worms, aphids picked off by hand. Children helped in the garden, learning which plants were which. How to thin seedlings so the strongest could grow. How to tell when vegetables were ready to harvest. The first harvest of spring greens was celebrated. Fresh food after a winter of stored and preserved items. The flavor of fresh greens, slightly bitter, intensely alive. Mixed into pottage, they transformed the meal. Summer brought abundance, peas by the handful, beans to pick daily, cabbages, onions, leeks ready when needed. The garden fed the family and provided surplus for the next winter. Herbs grew in the garden too, parsley, sage, thyme. These weren't just for flavoring food, they were medicine. A tea made from sage for a sore throat, thyme for digestion, parsley for freshening breath. Autumn in the garden meant harvest and preparation for winter. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots were pulled and stored. Onions were braided together and hung to dry. Cabbages were cut and stored in the root cellar. The garden was cleared, mulched. Perhaps a late crop of hardy greens might survive into early winter. And then the garden rested under snow, waiting for spring to begin the cycle again. That small plot of earth represented security. A bad year in the garden meant harder times ahead. A good year meant fuller bellies. Now, let's think about food beliefs and superstitions, because medieval people had ideas about food that went beyond simple nutrition. Hot and cold, wet and dry, these were the qualities assigned to foods in medieval medicine. The body needed balance between these qualities. Too much cold food and you might become phlegmatic. Too much hot food and you might become choleric. This was based on ancient Greek medicine, filtered through centuries of tradition. Physicians believed in it. So did common people, to varying degrees. Garlic was hot and dry, good for cutting through cold, wet conditions in the body. Cucumber was cold and wet, cooling, but perhaps not good for someone already cold and damp. The details were complex and often contradictory, but the basic idea that foods had qualities beyond taste and nutrition was widely accepted. Certain foods were considered appropriate for certain times of year. Heavy foods in winter, lighter foods in summer. This aligned with practical experience, even if the theoretical framework was questionable. Some foods were considered lucky or protective. Garlic hung by the door to ward off evil. salt scattered for protection, bread blessed with a cross before cutting. Waste was unlucky. Spilling salt was bad luck. You'd throw a pinch over your shoulder to ward off the consequences. Bread dropped on the floor was kissed and set aside for the poor, not thrown away. Children were taught that wasting food was sinful. God had provided the food. To waste it was to reject God's blessing. This belief had practical benefits. It reduced actual waste in times when food was too precious to squander. Dreams about food had meanings. Dreaming of bread meant prosperity. Dreaming of spoiled food meant coming troubles. The first fruits of harvest were sometimes left in the field as an offering to ensure future harvests. The last sheaf of grain was made into a corn dolly, a woven figure kept in the house for luck. Food was tied to the church calendar in specific ways. Certain foods for certain saints' days, goose on Michaelmas, eggs at Easter, pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, using up rich foods before Lent. These food traditions gave structure to the year. They created anticipation. They marked time in a world without written calendars for most people. A child knew that after the pancakes came the long Lenten fast. After Easter came eggs and spring greens. After Michaelmas came the slaughter of animals before winter. Food was calendar, ritual, medicine, luck, and sustenance all at once. Breathe that in for a moment. The complexity of it, the layers of meaning that surrounded even the simplest meal. Let's explore the difference between peasant food and noble food, because understanding the contrast helps us appreciate each. A noble's table might have white bread, roasted meats, pies filled with spiced meats, fruits in honey, wine from fine vineyards, multiple courses, servants bringing dish after dish. A peasant's table had dark bread and pottage, maybe cheese, ale, one pot, one loaf. But here's something interesting. The nutritional value of peasant food was often better than noble food. Dark bread with its whole grains provided more fiber, more nutrients than refined white bread. The varied vegetables in pottage offered vitamins. The simple diet was actually quite healthy when there was enough of it. Nobles suffered from gout, from digestive complaints caused by too much rich food. Peasants suffered from hunger, from deficiency diseases when food ran short. But when food was adequate, the peasant diet sustained hard physical labor remarkably well. Nobles could afford spices, yes. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, these made food taste different, certainly. But the peasants' herbs, the parsley and thyme and sage added flavor too, just different flavors. The real difference was in variety and abundance. Nobles never worried about running out of food. They had stores that lasted. They could afford to buy grain in lean years. They didn't go hungry in late winter. Peasants faced that constant anxiety. Would the food last? Would the harvest be good? Would winter be harsh? And nobles ate meat regularly. Beef, pork, mutton, venison, wild boar. Roasted, stewed, in pies. Several times a week, perhaps daily. Peasants ate meat rarely. Special occasions. Feast days. When they did eat it, it was savored. Remembered. There was also the matter of presentation. Noble food was arranged beautifully. Sauces in colors, shaped into fanciful forms, served on silver or fine pewter. Peasant food was served in wooden bowls, eaten with wooden spoons, drunk from wooden cups, function over form. But both noble and peasant understood that food was life. They just experienced that truth differently. Let's think now about feast days and how they broke the routine of daily meals. Christmas was special. If at all possible, there would be meat at Christmas. A goose, if the family kept geese. A piece of pork from the autumn slaughter, something beyond the daily pottage. White bread might grace the table. A rare treat. The contrast with daily dark bread made it taste even better. Special ale, brewed strong for the occasion. Perhaps mead, if someone had honey to spare, sweet and golden and warming. The Christmas meal was eaten after church, in the afternoon, the whole family together, perhaps a neighbor or two invited to share. The fire burning bright, candles lit, even though it meant using precious tallow. The meal would be slower than usual, time to savor, time to talk and laugh, time to feel grateful for what they had, however simple. After eating came rest, stories, songs perhaps, the rare luxury of leisure. Easter marked the end of Lent, 7 weeks of fasting, no meat, no dairy, no eggs. The restriction made Easter feast more meaningful. Eggs were central, coloured eggs, hard-boiled, egg dishes, custards if there was milk and honey, the return of butter, the return of cheese, meat again. How good it tasted after weeks without. The Easter meal was celebration and relief. Winter was ending, spring was here, food would become more plentiful. They had survived another year. Harvest feast was the village gathering. All who had worked bringing in the grain came together. The Lord often provided food and drink. It was his responsibility, part of the feudal contract. Bread from the new grain. Meat, probably pork or mutton, roasted over open fires. Vegetables from the late summer gardens. Strong ale flowed freely. There was music, dancing, games, relief and celebration after weeks of back-breaking harvest work. The harvest feast was important socially. It reinforced community bonds. It gave workers a sense that their labor was valued and recognized. Weddings brought feasts, scaled to what the families could afford. For peasants, this might mean better pottage, more bread, special ale, perhaps a meat pie, if resources allowed. The whole village might be invited. Weddings were community events. The wedding feast could last into the evening. Food was shared freely. Everyone contributed what they could. The new couple began their life together, surrounded by community and blessing. Saints' days scattered through the year also meant special foods. Each region had its patron saint, and that saint's day called for celebration. These feast days created rhythm. They gave people something to anticipate. In a life of hard work and simple fare, these moments of abundance were precious, and they created memories. Children remembered feast days, the special foods, the feeling of fullness, the happiness of family gathered together. Let's drift now toward how different stages of life experienced food. Infants were nursed. Mother's milk for the first year, often longer. This was best for the child, and also practical, no need to prepare special food. When nursing ended, the transition to solid food was gradual. Bread soaked in milk, very thin pottage, more liquid than solid, gradually thickening as the child grew. Young children ate smaller portions of adult food. Their growing bodies needed nourishment, but they also worked less and burned fewer calories than adults. A mother would set aside the softest pieces of vegetables from the pottage for the youngest children, would make sure they got enough bread, would water down ale even more than usual for little ones. Teenagers, working hard and growing fast, were often hungry. They ate adult portions or more. A growing boy helping in the fields needed substantial food to maintain his strength. Young women, too, needed good nutrition. Many married young, became pregnant young. Pregnancy and nursing required extra food, and families tried to provide it when they could. Adults in their prime working years needed steady, substantial meals to maintain their strength for labor. A man ploughing fields, a woman carrying water and grinding grain, both needed calories and nutrients. The elderly often ate less, partly because they moved less, needed less fuel, partly because they sometimes gave up food so younger family members could eat more. An old grandmother might insist she wasn't hungry, nibbling at bread while giving her portion of pottage to a grandchild. This generosity was honored, but it also reflected hard reality about scarce resources. When food was truly scarce, the young were prioritized. Children were the future. They had to survive. Adults in their working years kept the family functioning. The elderly had lived their lives. It sounds harsh to modern ears, but in a world where one bad harvest could mean death, these calculations were made. In better times, with food more plentiful, everyone ate well. The old were cared for. Children were indulged. Adults felt secure. Food security meant family security. Let's think about the sounds and smells of a medieval kitchen. The crackle of the fire, constant background noise, wood popping, flames shifting, the bubble and hiss of the pottage pot, that rhythmic sound of liquid simmering, steam rising, the scrape of a wooden spoon against the iron pot, stirring, checking, tasting. The thump of dough being kneaded on a wooden board, rhythmic, methodical, the sound of work being done, the scratch of a knife against a cutting board, chopping onions, slicing bread, preparing vegetables. Children's voices in the background, playing, arguing, asking when dinner would be ready, the cluck of chickens outside, the low of a cow, animal sounds mixed with human sounds, and the smells. Smoke always, from the fire. It permeated everything, clothing, hair, the walls of the cottage, bread baking, that incredible smell that made mouths water and stomachs growl, pottage simmering, the earthy smell of vegetables and grain cooking together, onions and garlic, sharp and savory, herbs drying in bundles, releasing their scent, ale fermenting, yeasty and slightly sour. In autumn, apples stored in the house, sweet and faintly musty. In winter, the metallic smell of cold air when the door opened, the contrast between outside chill and inside warmth. These smells meant home, safety, sustenance. They were as much a part of life as the food itself. A medieval person transported to our time would find our kitchens strange, the silence of electric appliances, the absence of smoke, the bright lights, food that appears without hours of preparation. And we, transported to their time, would find their kitchens overwhelming. The constant smoke, the dim light, the endless work required for even the simplest meal. But the fundamental purpose remains the same across centuries, transforming raw ingredients into nourishment, creating comfort, feeding family. Let's explore some regional and cultural variations now. Medieval Europe was diverse. What peasants ate in England differed from France, which differed from Germany, which differed from Italy. In northern regions, England, northern France, Germany, bread was often made from rye or barley. Oats were common for pottage. Root vegetables like turnips thrived. Preserved fish, especially herring, was a staple. The climate dictated what could be grown. Short growing seasons, cold winters, hardy crops were necessary. In southern regions, southern France, Spain, Italy, wheat was more common. The climate supported it better. Olive oil replaced butter for cooking. Wine replaced ale in many areas. Different vegetables thrived. Tomatoes wouldn't arrive until much later, but eggplants, artichokes, various greens. The Mediterranean diet, even for peasants, included more variety in vegetables and fruits. Olives and olive oil were everyday items. Cheese from sheep and goats. Coastal communities everywhere ate more fish. Fresh fish when possible, preserved fish otherwise. Fishing villages had access to varieties inland communities never saw. Inland communities, especially in forested regions, relied more on preserved meats, when they had meat at all. More foraging mushrooms from the forest, wild berries, nuts. Mountainous regions had sheep and goats rather than cattle. These animals could graze on steep slopes where cows couldn't go. The cheese from these animals was different, sharper, more varied in flavor. Goat cheese was softer, milder. Sheep cheese aged well, became hard and flavorful. In areas with peat bogs, peat was used for fuel instead of wood. This affected cooking slightly different heat, different smoke flavor. River valleys supported better agriculture, more varied crops, richer soil from flooding. These communities generally had better food security. But across all these variations, the fundamental pattern held. Peasants ate what they could grow, preserve, or afford. Bread and grain formed the base. Vegetables filled in. Meat was rare, meals repeated with slight variations. A peasant in England and a peasant in Italy would recognize each other's lives. The details differed. The struggle was the same. The sameness across cultures is more striking than the differences. The medieval peasant experience of food was remarkably similar whether you lived in England or Italy or Germany. The daily bread, the daily pottage, the daily ale, the daily work of keeping the family fed. Universal human experience, wearing slightly different clothes depending on geography. Now let's explore the rhythm of a woman's day, centered around food preparation. This might help us understand just how much labor went into feeding a medieval family. She woke before dawn. The fire had burned low overnight, but not out. She added wood, coaxed it back to flame. The cottage was cold, but the fire would warm it. First task, water. She took the wooden bucket, walked to the well or stream, filled it, carried it back. Heavy work. Several trips might be needed: water for cooking, for washing, for drinking. If there was a cow, she milked it. Early morning milk, still warm, some saved for drinking, some for making cheese. She checked the pottage pot, always something in it, simmering. Added water if it had cooked down too much overnight, stirred it, decided what to add today. Perhaps she'd go to the garden. Pulled a few onions, some leeks, checked the cabbages, picked peas or beans if they were ready, pulled up a turnip or two. Back to the cottage, chopped the vegetables, added them to the pot. The smell began to build. That comforting smell of food cooking. If it was bread day every few days, typically she'd start the dough. Flour from the storage bin, water, salt, mix, knead. The physical work of pressing and folding, pressing and folding. While the dough rose, other tasks. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, churning butter if there was enough cream, spinning wool, mending clothing, watching children. Always something. Never idle. Mid-morning, she'd check the risen dough, punch it down, shape loaves, let them rise again. This timing had to work around everything else she needed to do. By midday, the family gathered for dinner. The main meal. She served the pottage from the pot, cut bread from yesterday's or the day before's baking, poured ale into wooden cups. Everyone ate. She ate too, standing sometimes, ready to refill bowls or get more bread. After dinner, she cleaned wooden bowls with water and a rag. Simple cleaning, nothing elaborate. If bread was ready, she'd take the risen loaves to the communal oven. Wait her turn, bring back the baked loaves. The smell following her home. Afternoon was for other work, but the fire and pot were always there, always something cooking. She'd add more to the pot as needed, check it periodically. Evening came. The family gathered again for supper. More pottage, more bread, more ale. Simpler than dinner, but still requiring her attention. After supper, more cleaning. Banking the fire for the night, covering it with ash so it would burn slow and low, not go out entirely. Then finally, rest. But even as she slept, part of her mind was on tomorrow, what needed to be done, what food was available, how to stretch it. This was every day, every single day. The work never ended. A woman's skill in managing this endless cycle was what made a household function. A skilled cook and household manager was valuable, respected. Her work kept everyone alive and fed. Young girls watched and learned. This would be their life too. The knowledge of timing, of managing scarce resources, of making something nourishing from humble ingredients, this was their inheritance. Mothers taught daughters not through written instruction but through doing. Watch how I knead, see how I know when the bread is ready, notice how I use every scrap. This knowledge was power. A woman who could brew good ale, bake good bread, make tasty pottage had status in her community. Other women sought her advice. Her family was well fed, and there was satisfaction in it. We might see endless drudgery, but there was also skill, creativity within constraints, the pride of feeding your family well despite limitations. The smell of good bread baking, the sight of family eating contentedly, the knowledge that your work made this possible. These weren't small things. Let's think about specific variations in pottage, because although we've mentioned it often, we haven't fully explored its variety. Frumenty was pottage made from wheat. The grains were hulled, cracked, and cooked slowly until they broke down into a porridge-like consistency. This might be enriched with milk if available. Sweetened with honey on special occasions. Frumenty was festive food, richer than daily pottage. Peas pottage was exactly what it sounds like: pottage made primarily from peas. Dried peas, soaked overnight, then cooked until they broke down into a thick mush. Some onions, perhaps some herbs, sometimes a bit of salt pork if you had it. This was filling, protein-rich, and the basis for the nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That rhyme, by the way, reflects reality. The pot really did simmer for days, with new ingredients added as it was eaten down. Bean pottage was similar to peas pottage, but made with fava beans or other beans. Slightly different flavor, equally filling. Oat pottage was simpler. Oats cooked in water or ale until soft. This was breakfast food often, quick to prepare, warm and filling. In Scotland and northern England especially, oat pottage was daily fare. Barley pottage was another variation. Barley grains cooked slowly, perhaps with vegetables added, sometimes with bits of fish or meat if available. The beauty of pottage was that the basic concept grains or legumes cooked in liquid until soft could be endlessly varied based on what was available. In spring, fresh greens brightened the pottage. In summer, a rainbow of vegetables. In autumn, root vegetables and the last of the harvest. In winter, dried peas and beans, perhaps a precious bit of salt pork. The consistency varied too. Some days thick enough to stand a spoon in it, other days thinner, more soup-like. Depended on how much liquid was added, how long it cooked, what ingredients were used, and the flavor built over days. Monday's pottage had barley and turnips. Tuesday, onions and cabbage were added to what remained. Wednesday, some peas. By Thursday, the pottage had layers of flavor, history in a pot. Each family's pottage tasted unique. Each cook had her own way of doing things. This combination of vegetables, that particular herb, this amount of salt. Children grew up with these specific flavors. The taste of home was literally the taste of their mother's pottage. Let's think about bread in more detail as well. We've mentioned dark bread, maslin, rye bread, but let's be more specific about what these meant. Rye bread was dense, heavy, with a slightly sour flavor from natural fermentation. It was dark brown, almost black. The texture was coarse. It didn't rise as much as wheat bread because rye has less gluten. This bread was filling. One slice was substantial. It kept well, actually better than wheat bread in some ways. The crust was thick and hard, protecting the interior. Peasants cut thick slices. These could be used as trencher's plates for meals. The bread soaked up juices from pottage or meat. Then the trencher itself was eaten, or given to animals, or distributed to the poor. Barley bread was even denser than rye bread, grey in color, heavy, very filling. It crumbled more easily than rye bread, so it was often eaten fresh or soaked in liquid. Maslin was the compromise. Mix rye and wheat flour. You got bread that had some of wheat's lighter texture and rising capability, but cost less than pure wheat bread. This was probably the most common bread for peasants who had access to both grains. Oat bread, or oat cakes, were different entirely. Flatbreads, unleavened, cooked on a griddle rather than baked in an oven. These were especially common in Scotland and northern England where oats grew well. Oat cakes were quick to make. Mix oat flour and water into a dough. Roll thin. Cook on a hot griddle, a few minutes per side. Done. These could be made fresh daily without the time investment of leavened bread. The texture was different, crisper, flatter, with oat's distinctive nutty flavor. Oat cakes traveled well. They could be carried in a pouch without crumbling. White wheat bread was luxury. The wheat had to be sifted to remove the bran, creating fine white flour. This took extra work and reduced the amount of flour you got from a given amount of grain. So, white bread was expensive. When peasants tasted white bread maybe once a year at a harvest feast, it was a revelation. So light, so soft, so different from their daily bread. But their daily bread sustained them. It was what they knew, and after a lifetime of dark bread, it tasted right. It tasted like home. Let's consider the drinking vessels and eating implements more carefully. Wooden cups, wooden bowls, wooden spoons. These were standard in peasant households. Wood was available, relatively cheap, functional. The cups might be turned on a lathe, making them smooth and round, or they might be carved from a solid block of wood. They developed a patina over time, darkening from use, absorbing flavors. Bowls came in different sizes, smaller for children, larger for adults, deep bowls for pottage, shallower for bread and cheese. Spoons were carved, shaped, smoothed. A good spoon was treasured. It fit your hand perfectly. You used the same spoon for years, decades even. Knives were personal possessions. You carried your knife with you. Used it for eating, but also for work, cutting rope, sharpening sticks, 100 daily tasks. At meals, you'd use your knife to cut meat if there was any, to cut bread, to spear food from a communal dish. Some families might own a few pewter items, a cup, perhaps a plate. These were valuable, passed down through generations. Pewter was expensive but lasted forever. It could be melted down and recast if damaged. Pottery was less common in northern Europe, more common in Mediterranean regions. Clay pots and plates. These were fragile but held heat well, but mostly wood. Simple, functional, durable. The table itself might be just a board laid across trestles. When not in use, it could be taken down, stored against the wall. The cottage was small. Furniture needed to be multi-purpose. Benches for sitting, maybe a chair for the head of the household. Simple, solid, functional. The hearth was the center, the fire burning, the pot hanging, the heat radiating. Around this, life happened. Let your mind settle on that image. The simple cottage, the fire, the pot, the family gathered around, the smell of pottage, the warmth of the fire, the comfort of familiar routine. Let's drift now toward the end of our journey through medieval peasant food. Think about what we've explored together: the daily rhythm of meals, the labor of preparation, the anxiety of preservation, the hope at harvest, the hunger of late winter, the small joys of fresh bread and summer peas. Now, before we close, let's consider a few more aspects of this food culture that reveal how deeply woven it was into the fabric of daily life. Think about the communal nature of food preparation, the village mill where grain was ground, the communal oven where bread was baked. These weren't just practical necessities, they were social spaces. Women gathering at the oven, waiting for their bread to bake. This was when news was shared, when advice was given, when friendships were reinforced. The smell of baking bread became associated not just with food, but with community, with connection. The mill was similar. Taking your sack of grain to be ground meant encountering neighbors, hearing news, perhaps conducting other business while you waited. The miller knew everyone. He heard everything. The mill was a hub of village life. Markets in nearby towns were events. Peasants might walk several miles to reach a market. There they could sell surplus eggs, cheese, vegetables, buy salt, perhaps some smoked fish, tools, cloth. But markets were also social occasions. You saw people from other villages, heard news from farther away, felt part of something larger than your own small community. And there was food at markets. Vendors selling hot pies, roasted nuts, fresh bread. For a few coins, you could buy something you didn't have to prepare yourself. A small luxury, a treat. Children loved market days. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the possibility of something sweet, candied fruits if they were very lucky. The bustle and energy of so many people in one place. Let's think about cooking skills and how they were passed down. A girl learned to cook by watching her mother, helping at first with simple tasks, carrying water, stirring the pot, cutting vegetables, gradually taking on more complex work. By the time she married, usually in her late teens, she'd know how to make bread, brew ale, prepare pottage, preserve food. These weren't written recipes. This was knowledge in her hands, in her memory. She knew how the dough should feel, how the pottage should smell when it was ready, how to tell if ale had fermented enough. Practical knowledge, gained through years of practice. Boys learned differently. They might help with heavier tasks, carrying water, chopping wood for the fire, but cooking was primarily women's work in peasant households. However, men working in the fields still needed food knowledge. They could make simple meals if necessary. Heat pottage, cut bread, brew weak ale. Survival skills, really. And there were men who cooked professionally, bakers, tavern keepers, cooks in noble households. For them, cooking was trade and livelihood, requiring different skills and knowledge. But in peasant families, food preparation was the woman's domain. Her skill in making good bread, good ale, good pottage determined the family's quality of life in many ways. A good cook could make meager ingredients appetizing, could stretch scarce resources, could keep the family healthy through lean times. This was valuable knowledge, respected and honored. Let's consider food and religion more deeply. Fasting wasn't just about avoiding certain foods. It was about discipline, about focusing on spiritual rather than physical needs. Wednesdays and Fridays were typically fast days. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. For peasants, this often meant little change from ordinary days. They didn't eat meat most days anyway. But the restriction on eggs and dairy could be felt, especially by children who loved fresh milk and eggs. Lent was the great fast. 40 days, mirroring Christ's fast in the wilderness. No animal products at all, just bread, vegetables, fish, thin pottage, made with water instead of milk. The church taught that fasting was good for the soul. It taught discipline. It reminded people of their spiritual nature. It created shared experience across all of Christendom. And practically, fasting in late winter and early spring aligned with scarcity. Food was running low anyway. The religious requirement matched economic reality. Breaking the fast at Easter was therefore both spiritual and practical celebration, the return of eggs, of dairy, of meat if you could afford it, the return of abundance as spring arrived. Religious joy and earthly relief intertwined. The church also provided charity. In theory, the wealthy were supposed to give alms to the poor. Monasteries sometimes distributed food to those in need. This wasn't systematic or reliable, but it existed. And within communities, there was Christian duty to help neighbors. If one family had plenty while another struggled, sharing was expected, not enforced by law, but enforced by social pressure and religious teaching. Food was never just food. It was always also about morality, community, spiritual life. Let's think about traveling and food. Most peasants rarely traveled far from their villages, but sometimes they had to market, to visit relatives, on pilgrimage if they were particularly devout. Traveling meant carrying food. Bread, obviously, cheese if you had it, perhaps some dried meat or fish, a leather bottle of ale. The bread would get hard after a day or two, but hard bread could be softened in ale or in pottage at an inn. Nothing was wasted. Inns existed along common routes, simple establishments really, a room, a fire, basic food and ale. Travellers would pay for a meal and a place to sleep. The meal at an inn was probably pottage and bread, standard fare, maybe some cheese. The ale might be better or worse than what you made at home, but it was hot food and shelter, which mattered when you were far from home. Pilgrims travelling long distances relied on monasteries for hospitality. Monasteries were required to offer food and shelter to travellers. The quality varied, but at minimum you'd get bread and ale, a place to sleep. For peasants, travel was expensive. Every day away from home was a day not working. Food had to be carried or purchased. It wasn't undertaken lightly. But sometimes it was necessary, and when peasants did travel, they saw how others lived, ate different regional foods, brought ideas back home. A woman who travelled to a market in a larger town might come home with a new recipe idea, a new way of preparing something. These small innovations spread slowly through communities. Let's think about leftovers and waste. Nothing was wasted. This principle governed medieval peasant food culture absolutely. Stale bread became trenchers, or it was soaked to soften it, or fed to animals. Bread too mouldy to eat, chickens and pigs would eat it. Bones from meat, rare enough that they mattered, were boiled for broth, then boiled again, every bit of flavor and nutrition extracted, then maybe given to dogs or crushed for fertilizer. Vegetable scraps went into the pottage pot or to the animals. Whey from cheese-making fed pigs. Buttermilk was drunk or used in cooking. The only things truly wasted were things that couldn't be eaten or fed to animals, and even then, ash from the fire went into gardens as fertilizer. Scraps of cloth were patched and repatched until they fell apart, then used as rags. This wasn't environmental consciousness as we understand it. This was survival. When resources are scarce, you use everything. A modern person would be amazed at how little garbage a medieval peasant household produced. Almost everything was used, reused, transformed, consumed. Leftover pottage from one meal became the base for the next. Fresh ingredients added, the pot topped up with water or ale, back onto the fire. The pot rarely emptied completely. This meant flavors built up over days. The pottage had depth, complexity, layers of flavor. Each family's pottage tasted unique because it carried the history of their recent meals. Let's consider food and the seasons in more intimate detail. Spring hunger was real. By March or April, winter stores were severely depleted. The new harvest was months away. This was the lean time, the hungry gap. People ate less. Meals were smaller. Pottage was thinner, more water, fewer ingredients. Bread was rationed. But spring also brought wild foods. Dandelion greens, bitter but nutritious, appeared in fields. Wild garlic grew in woods. Nettles could be cooked like spinach. These wild greens were gathered eagerly. Children were sent to forage. Anything edible was welcome. This supplemental food could make the difference between genuine hunger and merely tight rations. Spring was also when animals gave birth. Calves, lambs, kids. This meant milk again. Through winter, as animals weren't nursing, milk production dropped or stopped. Spring brought fresh milk back. The first milk of spring was celebration. Fresh, creamy, rich, made into soft cheese immediately because it wouldn't keep. This fresh cheese, still warm, was delicious after months without. Summer was abundance. The garden produced daily. Fresh peas, beans, greens, onions, berries ripened in woods and hedgerows. Strawberries, raspberries, blackberries. Children ate them by the handful. Adults made preserves if they had honey. Summer pottage was thick with vegetables. Fresh herbs brightened every dish. Meals were satisfying, varied, plentiful. But summer also required work. Hay had to be cut and dried. Gardens needed constant tending. Food had to be preserved for winter while it was abundant. Vegetables were dried. Beans and peas left to mature on the plant, then dried. Herbs cut and hung to dry. Some vegetables pickled if vinegar was available. Late summer brought grain harvest, the most critical time of the year. Everything depended on bringing in the grain successfully. Every able body helped. Children, elderly, everyone who could work, did work. Dawn to dusk. Cutting grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves, stacking sheaves into shocks to dry. The work was back-breaking. But there was also camaraderie. Songs sung in rhythm with the work. Shared meals in the field at midday. The collective effort of the community working together toward survival. After harvest came threshing, separating grain from chaff. More hard work. Then winnowing, tossing grain in the air to let wind blow away the chaff. Then finally, grain into storage. Only then could people relax. The harvest was in. There would be bread through winter. Autumn brought abundance of different kind. Nuts in the forest, hazelnuts, walnuts, chestnuts. These were gathered, stored. Rich in fat and protein, they supplemented winter diets. Apples and pears ripened. Some eaten fresh, others carefully stored for winter. A good apple, firm and sweet, in January was a treasure. And autumn was when pigs were slaughtered. After a year of fattening on scraps and forest forage, the pig was ready. Late October, early November, before first hard freeze, butchering a pig was community event. Neighbors helped. In exchange, they'd receive some meat, and the family would help when it was their turn to slaughter. Every part of the pig was used, meat cut into pieces. Some eaten fresh, a rare feast of fresh meat, most salted or smoked for preservation. Organs cooked immediately or made into sausages. Blood saved for blood pudding. Fat rendered into lard for cooking. Skin scraped clean for leather. Bones saved for broth. One pig fed a family for months if carefully rationed. Small pieces of salted pork-flavored pottage through winter. Lard made bread and pastries possible for special occasions. Winter was survival mode, living off what had been stored: grain, dried vegetables, salted meat, apples from storage, root vegetables from the cellar. Meals became monotonous. The same pottage variations, the same bread, day after day, waiting for spring. But there was also comfort in that routine. The warm cottage, the fire always burning, the family together, long winter evenings for stories, for handwork, for rest. Winter nights were long. People went to bed early because there was no light to work by. Sleep was warmth and rest. And in sleep, you didn't feel hunger as acutely. Food and sleep intertwined. A full belly made sleep easier. An empty belly made it harder. But either way, winter nights were for sleeping. Let's drift now to the very end of our journey. We've wandered through meals from dawn to dark, from spring hunger to autumn abundance, from daily bread to feast day celebrations, from the kitchen garden to the communal oven. We've explored how peasant families fed themselves through skill, hard work, community support, and careful management of scarce resources. Food was survival. But it was also more than that. It was community. It was ritual. It was the shared experience of being human in a hard world. The medieval peasant at their simple meal, eating pottage from a wooden bowl, sharing bread with family, was engaging in the same fundamental act we engage in every time we eat. Nourishing the body, connecting with others, taking a moment to rest. Their food was different from ours. Their lives were different from ours. But the basic need, the basic comfort of a meal, was the same. We often romanticize medieval times, or we see them as completely alien. But in the matter of food, we can find connection. We still eat bread. We still make stews. We still gather with family for meals. We still mark celebrations with special foods. The thread runs unbroken from their tables to ours. Think of the countless meals prepared by countless hands over countless centuries. Think of the mothers and fathers feeding their children, the grandparents passing down recipes, the communities celebrating harvests together. All of it part of the same human story, all of it connected. You are part of this lineage too. Every time you break bread, every time you share a meal, you participate in something ancient and universal. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, let these images settle gently in your mind. The smoke from cottage fires, the smell of baking bread, the sound of pottage bubbling in an iron pot, the quiet satisfaction of a simple meal after a hard day's work. Let yourself rest in the knowledge that people have been feeding themselves and each other for as long as there have been people. The particulars change. The struggle remains. The comfort remains. You are fed. You are safe. You are connected to all those who came before and all who will come after. Let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of those long ago days. The steady work, the simple meals, the quiet evenings by the fire. Sleep well, friend. Tomorrow there will be bread and ale and pottage once more. The cycle continues, and you are part of it. Thank you for wandering with me through these medieval kitchens and cottages. May the gentle tales of ordinary lives help you find your rest. Good night.